Good morning, everyone. Boker Tov. Welcome to Modiin and Beyond on Radio Modiin. Brought to you, as always, by me, Rolene Marks. And Israel has just come to a complete standstill as the country has united to pay tribute to the 6 million Jewish martyrs and heroes who were brutally murdered during the Holocaust. Today marks Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Modiin and Beyond with me, Rolene Marks, on Radio Modiin for a special Yom HaShoah commemoration. Today is Yom HaShoah. It is a day that we come to a standstill, as we just have for the memorial siren. Today is a day that we bear witness and we swear never again. Today is a day we honor the memory of the over 6 million Jews who were brutally murdered during the Holocaust. Today is a day that we honor the brave heroes and martyrs who just 80 years ago stood up against the Nazi war machine in the Warsaw Ghetto, fighting with all their might. Today is a day that Yad Vashem has set aside to honor and mark 80 years since the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Yom HaShoah is a day that is different to International Holocaust Memorial Day because it is a day that we in Israel and Jews around the world mark and commemorate specifically the murders of 6 million Jews. International Holocaust Memorial Day on January the 27th is a day set aside by the United Nations that is dedicated to remembering and preserving the memory of the Holocaust and all its victims. We also remember that the Holocaust wasn't just carried out by the Nazis, but also by their collaborators in other countries like Lithuania. And I'm very, very honored to be joined today by documentary filmmaker, the producer, and the director behind the award-winning documentary J'accuse, Michael Kretzmer, who dedicates his life to fighting to hold Lithuania responsible and accountable for the murder of many of our families. Many of us in Modiin and around Israel come from Lithuania or are Litvak. Michael will tell us all about J'accuse and the fight, not just to hold Lithuania accountable for the murder of our families and for Lithuanian Jewry, but also to restore the honor of Lithuania's Jewish community. Michael Kretzmer, welcome to Modiin and Beyond.
Thanks, Rolene, and what a pleasure it is to be with you, and especially to be in Israel on a day like this.
We can't hear you, Michael. If you could turn your microphone on, please.
My microphone's up to the maximum. Can you hear me now?
Still can't hear you.
Okay, hold on. About now?
We've got you. Michael, welcome to Modiin and Beyond. Today is a sacred day. The Shoah, the Holocaust, did not start with the gas chambers and with the death camps, but it started with words and deeds carried out by the Nazi annihilation machine and their various collaborators. And it wasn't just the Nazis who are responsible for the murder of our families, for our ancestors in the forests of Lithuania, in the fields of Ukraine, are the souls of our family members. Now, you have made a brilliant documentary. It's called J'accuse. It is winning critical acclaim. It is winning awards. And when I heard the title J'accuse, it took me right back to the Eichmann trial when we heard Zvi Hausner's iconic opening argument saying, J'accuse, you are accused. And I felt that it's a very, very apt title for calling to account the Lithuanian government and seeking justice and giving voice to those who don't have a voice for themselves. Can you tell us about the premise behind this documentary? What made you do it?
Um, yes, Rolene, I don't know if you heard my first comment. It was just to say how wonderful it is to be in Israel on a day like today and to be talking to
We
you.
still can't hear
This,
you. We're battling to hear you.
I honestly don't know why, I'm afraid. I thought you could hear me there. Can you hear me, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. Shall I just, I beg your pardon? Get close. Okay, how's that? Is that all right? Okay. Um, Rolene, I'll repeat this for the third time. What a pleasure it is to be in Israel on a day like today. The actual words J'accuse actually has a earlier provenance than the Eichmann trial. It was famously coined by Zola in his defense of Dreyfus, who of course was set up by anti-Semites as the Jew who can't be trusted and the Jew who betrayed France. And it's a cry for truth. Like many South African Litvak Jews, our family avoided discussion, specific discussion of the Lithuanian Holocaust. But I went back to Lithuania in 2019 to attend the unveiling of a memorial to my own family who were murdered there. They were murdered along with 2,400 Jews on the 8th of August 1941 in a small town called Biržai in northern Lithuania. And we had this named monument. It's a brilliant project. And there was a drape over this monument. And when the drape fell, I found myself staring at about 60 Kretzmers, in other words, my own family. And suddenly it became apparent to me the cost of the Holocaust for my own family. It explained the depression of my grandmother, the depression of my mother, the anger of my father, and many other things. And I made it my business to try and understand what happened and to try and offer some sort of protest. When I discovered months after that that there was a concerted and very successful campaign by the Lithuanian government to lie about history, I became obsessed with the story, and that's the origins of the film I made. The film is the J'accuse in this is directed squarely at the Lithuanian government, who to this day have a systemic policy of telling lies to sanitize mass murders and then pretend to us, the Jews, how much they love us. It's an intolerable insult, and I don't think any other people in the world would accept this. But we Jews, for some reason, we accept it. I think this is due to 1700 years of pragmatism in the face of anti-Semites, 1700 being the time of Constantine.
Now, this is very, very personal for you. You've just shared a little bit about your family story. I recently read an article that was written by you. In fact, it's actually featured in a publication called Lay of the Land. And you also speak about the impact that the late Lord Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs had on you. You speak very, very warmly about him. Can you share a little bit about the impact that he had on your life? And is this related to you doing this documentary?
I think indirectly. I'm one of these Jews who had an intensely Jewish upbringing in southern Africa. I was from Zimbabwe, Rhodesia as it was before then. And we were a typical, nominally Orthodox family, but we weren't kosher. We didn't bother about Shabbat. There was certainly no Torah learning. And as soon as I got to England, I kind of left the Jewish fold for a long time. And what made me re-engage, I've always been a great supporter of Israel, though. But what made me re-engage with Judaism were the writings of Jonathan Sachs. And it's turned me into a sort of quasi-religious-ish Jew. I don't think Jonathan Sachs was in any way responsible for my obsession of the Holocaust, although he has written very eloquently, as he has on everything. This was more to do with personal family history and the political history of our people and how one responds to the insult both of anti-Semitism, but even more importantly, to the insult of denial of the Holocaust. And to think that this is happening today in such an egregious way through the government of Lithuania obsessed me. I couldn't get over the fact. And when I made my film, I decided who is going to be the voice in this film. You know, as a journalist, Rolene, you will appreciate one has to decide on a voice one uses in order to tell the story. And I struggled with this for a long time. Who was telling the story? And eventually I decided the only people whose story I wanted to tell and who had the voice were the victims. So I've tried to make the film in their name and in their voice. And this, I think, gives the film a power that most documentary films don't have because they set out to be objective. Mine is not objective. Mine is a subjective cry for justice from these people. And I believe it's our duty, particularly on a day like today, to listen to them very closely.
He was absolutely the most extraordinary man. And you've really had a lot of extraordinary people as part of J'accuse. We spoke to Grant Gochin, who is featured in J'accuse on International Holocaust Memorial Day. He shared his personal story. He also spoke about somebody who is absolutely pivotal, and that is the incredible Sylvia Foti. For many of our viewers and listeners who may not be familiar with Sylvia Foti and the role she plays, I mean, this is quite extraordinary. He spoke about how he came into contact with her. What is your connection to Sylvia Foti? And for people who haven't seen the documentary, what is her connection? Because this is really something quite exceptional.
I think you're right, Rolene. I think Sylvia is quite exceptional. I'll try and explain to your visitors who she is and where she got where she was. Sylvia Foti is an American-Lithuanian woman who grew up in Chicago in the very Lithuanian area of Market Park. And she grew up as a kind of princess, a Lithuanian diaspora princess. And why? Because her grandfather was a guy called Jonas Noreika, was a great war hero for Lithuania. He's a man who died at the age of 36, a very brutal death at the hands of the KGB in Lithuania. And he's a man who Lithuanians were taught was martyred for Lithuanian independence. So Sylvia inherited both this role as the granddaughter of the great Jonas Noreika, but her mother, as she was dying, handed her a project. She said, Sylvia, I've started this biography of my father, Sylvia's grandfather. Please complete it because I will not be able to. So Sylvia made a promise she would complete this biography. And she thought this biography would be a wonderful tribute to her grandfather and a great patriotic explanation of Lithuania and its difficult relationship with Russia and its desperate yearning for independence. In other words, she thought she was going to write a very heroic story that all Lithuanians would be proud of. Now, when her mother and her grandmother, Noreika's widow, died, she was also honor bound to take their ashes back to Lithuania for burial, which happened, and there was a great big public celebration of this burial. One of the country's previous presidents were there. A huge number of dignitaries and celebrities were there. But the following day, she was invited to attend a school named after her grandfather, Jonas Noreika, and she went there. And when she was there, the headmaster, first of all, congratulated her, and she asked the story for her book. How come the school was named after my grandfather? And he explained, well, he was a great hero. Before this, we had a horrible Soviet name, so it was natural, since he was born in this region, that we would call the school after him. Then he called her to the side, and he said to her, but, I got a lot of grief over this. And she said, why? Grief from whom? And he said, the Jews. The Jews gave him a hard time. And she said, why the Jews? She was that naive. She said, what have the Jews possibly got to say about my grandfather? And he said, well, he was accused of killing Jews. And this was the first time she had ever heard this rumor. Later, as she went through Lithuania, she discovered everybody knew this rumor that her grandfather had killed Jews. So there she was, charged with writing this book with this new knowledge. Now, the Lithuanian diaspora, I feel, is very similar to the Jewish diaspora. They are very insular, well, quite insular to a degree. They're paranoid. They have reason to be, given their history with Russia. They're very tribal. They're very close. They live together. So Sylvia was suddenly faced with this conundrum: what to do about the unfortunate facts of her grandfather. And I invite your listeners to ask what they would do. What would you do if you were writing a story about a great Jewish hero and you discovered he had a very dark side? And Sylvia took about 20 years to do this. It required years of therapy, but because she's a woman of great faith, she's a practicing Roman Catholic, and huge moral conscience and just great personal qualities, she decided she couldn't ignore this. She had to tell the full truth. And in so doing, in writing her book, she has gone against her people, her country, her community, and her own family, because she has exposed his crimes. Noreika was responsible for the killing of up to 10,000 Jews in conditions of great cruelty in northern Lithuania. She has documented it meticulously. There is no argument against her. She has exposed his guilt 100%, and as a result, she has suffered enormously. She lost her daughter to a drug overdose. She was divorced from her husband, and she suffered this intense personal isolation. She's the most remarkable woman, and my own feeling is she sets a challenge, not only to the Christian world, but a great challenge to the Jewish world. I feel we are honor bound to support Sylvia Foti. And when the Lithuanian government, as it always does, tells lies about the history of the destruction of Lithuanian Jewry, we are obliged to support Sylvia in her struggle for truth. She really is an incredible person. She's also, by the way, a nominee for this year's Nobel Peace Prize.
Let's talk for a moment about the Lithuanian government. Actually, I'm hearing you more clearer without my headphones, which is why I took them off. Let's talk about the Lithuanian government, because we're seeing a very, very alarming trend as time marches on, not just in Lithuania, but in Poland as well. Almost a will to absolve themselves of any responsibility, of any role that they played in the murders of our families, of the Jews, of Poland, of Lithuania. But let's talk about the Lithuanian government, because today the Lithuanian ambassador to Israel will be standing in front of the Litva community. As you said, there are so many South Africans that have Lithuanian heritage, many other communities as well. And she will not answer any questions about Lithuania's culpability, and she won't answer any questions about Noreika specifically. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think they're doubling down on a huge mistake they've made. They didn't count on Sylvia Foti. They counted on Jews being prepared to accept this nonsense for convenient reasons, but they did not count on Sylvia Foti or Grant Goshen, and there are other people too. There's Ephraim Zuro, there's Ruta Vanagaita, there's Professor David Katz, who've been banging the door for truth for ages. What Lithuania has done has set up an institute. It's called the Holocaust Center. And what this organization does, it employs over 100 historians. I use the word historians within inverted commas. And essentially, they're charged with the task of telling lies about the Holocaust. Let's look at the situation of Noreika. What they say about Noreika is, yes, he signed the orders for the deportations. Yes, he signed the orders for the imprisonment. But they've never come across a document which says, you must now kill the Jews, which is obvious. Nobody would ever write such a document. And they defend him they actually go further than that. They say, well, we feel Noreika was a rescuer of Jews, that he put us into prison camps, that he segregated us, that he robbed us, robbed all our property from us in order to save us. It is such an insult and such a lie, and it is such hypocrisy and such rudeness to come before Jewish audiences and pretend to be a friend and to pretend to care about the Lithuanian Holocaust when your government is actively actively involved in its denial. It is a shameful thing, and he should not be allowed to do it, in my opinion.
I mean, we have, talking about dichotomies, we're speaking about Lithuania. I just mentioned Poland. We have a very, very controversial decision now that as part of our youth tours to Poland, they will be visiting certain places that honor certain Poles that were responsible for carrying out some of the crimes of the Holocaust, which are crimes against humanity. We're talking about Lithuania and this absolute revision of their history. And then, you cut to Germany, and Germany, the worst perpetrators, taking responsibility for their role, making that concerted effort to educate future generations, to make sure the youth of Germany know to pay reparations, to educate, and of course their relationship with Israel. Something that I also find quite staggering, because I've been following both Grant's op-eds in the Times of Israel on lay of the land, as well as Sylvia Foti, who recently wrote about um, uh, lawsuits that Grant had filed against the Lithuanian government. I think there are about 9 lawsuits, and she writes in her op-ed about how the Lithuanian government has kind of rigged these lawsuits and yet claim victory. Can you please put this into some kind of perspective for us?
Well, yes, Grant launched all these lawsuits, and the substance of his case, which is that the Lithuanian government and its associated instruments, be they the courts, the public prosecutor, whoever, are all actively engaged in Holocaust lies. And they've never dealt with the substance of his issue. They always dismiss his legal actions on the narrowest of technical grounds. And then they stand before us and pretend to care. They put on that sad Holocaust face of theirs. And it's an insult. It's an insult. I mean, Lithuanian diplomats and consuls are always going to Holocaust memorials. Honestly, I sometimes think they have a holiday home at Yad Vashem. They're given such propaganda opportunities there. But ordinary Jews should see through this and should ask them and should insist they answer the questions. Why do you actively, systemically tell lies to defend Holocaust murderers? And if you are determined to do this, how can you possibly pretend to care about the Holocaust and to care about the Jewish people? Even a child can see this. I understand there are pragmatic reasons for having Lithuania as a friend. I use it in inverted commas. Sure, that's the life of a nation state, and one has to make compromises, however filthy they might be. But to have these Lithuanians constantly pretending to care so much when they do everything they can to distort history and to celebrate our murders is just absolutely unacceptable. It's an insult. And in my film, as I said, I try and give the voice to the victims. What would they say? What would their response be to the Lithuanian ambassador yet again going to Yad Vashem, putting on her stupid, sad face, when she's the one who's defending the person who killed a lot of these people? It's just, I don't think any other country in the world would accept this. For some reason, we do.
Let's talk about other countries, because what has their response, if any, been to this? And have they responded in any way to J'accuse? I see the documentary, which is absolutely brilliant. I implore my listeners, if you are able to see it, please go see it. As Michael, who so brilliantly put together and who has just said he's giving voices to the victims, because it is those voices that count. It is restoring their honor. What has the response of the international community been?
I'm not really to the film. I I made the film for almost no money. I made the film for $30,000, and to be honest with you, Rolene, I made it in response to a personal promise I made that I would do my own little bit to avenge the murders of my family, and to try and do something to promote truth. I never expected it to see the light of day. I thought it would die a death on YouTube, but at least I'll have done what I can do, because I used to be a filmmaker, and that's my only weapon. Since then, it's been seen across the world. It's won, I think it's won 100 awards and selections everywhere. Governments as yet have not had a response, but we are starting to chip away at this. And I'm optimistic that it will be shown and be discussed in Europe and the United States. It's also being beamed across Lithuania over Yom HaShoah and tomorrow. So it'll be interesting to see if the totally innocent Lithuanian people have something to say about their government holding them hostage in this way. However, my own view is that this is the fight of the Jewish people, that we, the Jewish people, should not accept this outrage. It's time to raise our voice. And I ask you, would any other people in the world accept this? Would black people accept it? Would Irish people? Would Arab people? Would Muslim people? Nobody would accept this insult. But we do, time and time again. Every time you see the Lithuanian ambassador putting on the sad face at Yad Vashem, remember, this is an insult. And we take it time and time and time again. And I think at the very least, we need an explanation as to why this is allowed.
We're speaking to Michael Kretzmer. He's the producer and director of the movie J'accuse, a brilliant, brilliant documentary. We're going to take a short commercial break. When we return, more with Michael Kretzmer.
Radio Modiin, התושבים מדברים. תאחז ביאה בפתי, בידי, בצעדים כבדים ורועדים אלך איתך אל עבר הבתים. ייקח לי אור, שתי זרועותיי תיקח, חיבקוך כשהיית ילד רך, ואם לאו מעט, הן לא תשכח הן עוד ידיים אוהבות כל כך. אם לבדך תלך בארץ סתיו, עמך יצא שירי המאוהב, כרוח שרך הזהבהב, הוא ילטף באהבה של פעם.
Okay, there we go. Can you hear me? Are we okay, guys?
We're hearing you perfectly.
Okay.
We're back on Modiin and beyond on Radio Modiin. I'm Rolene Marks. I'm so thrilled to be speaking to the producer, the director of J'accuse, the award-winning documentary. If you haven't seen it and you see it advertised in a city near you, I know it was screened in Ranana, please go and see it. It is so very, very important. Michael, we're talking about Lithuanian Jewry, and the murder of so many of our ancestors. I wonder if you can share your family's personal story with us. Where in Lithuania did they come from? What was their experience?
Uh, Really, my family, well, I'll talk just about my father's family because my mother's family was, I don't know as much about it. But my father's family came from a little town called Birge, where Jews had lived for 600 years. It was a very mixed community, although it was largely, like most of Lithuanian Jewry, mitnat Giddic, i.e. not Hasidic. There were Hasidic shuls, there was a Chabad shul there. There was even a Karaite shul. For those who perhaps don't know, the Karaites was a very ancient branch of Judaism, which never even embraced the Talmud and oral law. It was typical in many ways. The Jews were 40% of the town. They ran 70% of the businesses. There were, I think, 4 synagogues, 3 study houses, private cheders everywhere. There were music groups, drama groups. There were all sorts of youth movements. Some were socialist Zionists. Some were more on the Jabotinsky side. Some were religious. I think there was a B'nai Akiva there, or the forerunners of it. And this was a community that produced many, many great people. And what happened is, as soon as the Russians left, and even before the Germans arrived, the persecutions began. It started, I believe, with they used to carry out these celebrated murders that were intended to just send a clear signal to the Jews that times have changed and you are now no longer human. They dragged a very loved doctor out. He was a doctor to the whole town, and they murdered him. You know, when I went back in 2019, there were still people who remembered this man's act of kindness. And after that, what happened in Birge was fairly typical across Lithuania. The Jews were imprisoned. They were systematically robbed at every level by every kind of criminal, both official and unofficial. The girls were subjected to all sorts of indignities and humiliations, usually culminating in various forms of rape. The rabbi was dragged to the local lake where he was tortured for hours before being shot dead. Then they were segregated, and then on the 8th of August 1941, they were marched to a death pit in a pretty little forest grove, about, I don't know, a kilometer and a half from the town center. I imagine if the wind was right, you would have heard the shooting. You'd have certainly seen the processions and heard the weeping. And everybody was murdered there in a single day. After that, nobody bothered to collect their names. Nobody bothered to do anything about them. If you go, in fact, they've got a very great museum there. It's called the Cellar Museum in Birge. Very well known, very pretty, very beautiful. There's almost no mention of the Jews of Birge there. What they have, interestingly, is a virtual site. So Jews are not good enough to be exhibited in the museum, so they give them this little virtual entry, which itself is such an insult. It's so selectively written and so badly written. The history is so poorly presented. And they feel that that'll be enough. The Jews must settle for a third-rate little internet account of their lives there. But they must be spared the museum itself. Lithuania always puts on these big displays. So when we went there, there was this display. We were invited to the museum. We went up the stairs, and there was a great hall in which there was an obviously makeshift exhibition to give some idea of the Jews of Birge. And I took my son, who visited the following day, and we went up there, and it had been segregated. Ordinary Lithuanians were not allowed to go upstairs to see this exhibition.
Why
This
is
the
that?
degree.
Why do you think that is?
I think there are 2 reasons. Firstly, because I think they're anti-Semites. And the second reason, I think, is because they're embarrassed about their own history and they don't know how to account for it. There used to be 2 exhibits of interest in the museum, which thankfully have gone. One was a Torah scroll, which had been desecrated and turned into a lampshade. I presume it's down in the basement somewhere. Who knows? Maybe they use it for private parties. I've no idea. But they also have the names of the murderers up on the walls of the museum, astonishingly, as national heroes. It beggars belief how far they've gone, how little they care for what happened to us. I wouldn't mind, if they. I don't really care what they think of Jews. What I do care is the way they misrepresent history and then pretend to be our friends. This is what is so utterly unacceptable about the Lithuanian approach.
Well,
Sorry, Rolene, carry on.
well, as you say, they're very good at putting on sad face and attending memorials. And as you say, they must have a holiday home at Yad Vashem. But this is just, this is really more insulting than I think any of us can actually articulate, is to have the perpetrators of the worst genocide in humankind be glorified as heroes.
I agree with you. I mean, I think they've painted themselves into a very difficult corner now. They've been lying for over 80 years. And how do you undo those lies? How do you unpick the untruths you've been telling people for all that time? So what they do is double down, and they make a huge diplomatic effort across the world. Honestly, at any place where there's a Jewish community, you will find the Lithuanian ambassador and his envoys stinking up the synagogues by going there to pretend how much he loves the Jews. They tell us how much they love Latkes, how much they respect the Vilna Gaon, blah, blah, blah. That doesn't matter. What matters is how you lie about history. And this is where we should focus our efforts. I would hope Yad Vashem has something to say on this, and perhaps there are people listening to this who will ask them. I realize Yad Vashem has a difficult task, but the way they allow Lithuania to use Yad Vashem for propaganda reasons is simply unbelievable, in my opinion.
Let's talk about Lithuania today, because Lithuania is a great epicenter of culture. They're very proud of showcasing that. They want Lithuania to be celebrated, but there is a very, very dark and nefarious past that they need to be held accountable for. How do we go about doing that? What is the challenge that you put out to all of us?
Well, it is difficult. All nations, particularly in Eastern Europe, have very difficult histories. In fact, all nations have difficult histories. And the way we navigate them is very complex. But you still have the obligation to tell the truth. Now, as I say, I wouldn't mind if Lithuania said nothing about the Jews. But the fact is they have a thriving heritage industry now, where you're brought there and you're fed a whole bunch of lies about Jews all being communists and this and that. And you're supposed to accept this, at the same time accepting their sorrow for the Holocaust, which of course had nothing to do with them. That was all Nazis. To also, they ask us to understand that they're the victims of the Soviets and the Russians, which I have to say is true. Anybody who lives close to Russia know that it's not the best of neighbors. And Lithuania has indeed suffered greatly at the hands of Russia. I, for one, would be more than prepared to empathize with that history if they didn't go on to lie about their own history with the Jews. I think all we can do is insist that they stop telling lies. From then on, it's up to them. And they cannot continue to pretend to be a disciplined and ethical member of NATO and EU and the rest of it, while pursuing this systemic policy of lying.
Especially as time goes on and we lose more and more survivors on a daily basis. So the impetus is on us to bear witness and tell the stories of our ancestors. We often say unto every person there is a name, and so many of us, our names may be a little anglicized, but come from the villages of Lithuania and the shtetls across Europe. When I was speaking to Grant, one of the issues that he raised is he advocated for anybody of Lithuanian ancestry to apply for Lithuanian passports. I kind of loved his logic around that. What are your thoughts? His logic was that, that's honoring our memory. That's saying we were there. We were citizens as well.
As I see it, a passport is a constitutional right, a constitutional and legal right a person has because of his or her association with that country. And if Lithuanian law says that if you have a Lithuanian grandfather, or I don't even know what their law says, but I imagine it says something like if you have Lithuanian heritage, you have a right to claim Lithuanian citizenship. And I see they're always advertising on Facebook for people with Lithuanian heritage to claim this citizenship. So I have no problem with Jewish people claiming their Lithuanian passport. I personally wouldn't touch it until Sylvia Foti is president of that country, which I realize is unlikely to happen because I think it's too contaminated by their lies. But I certainly don't have an ethical or political problem with Jewish Lithuanians claiming their Lithuanian citizenship. They're human beings. They were Lithuanian. Why shouldn't they?
What does it feel like when you visit Lithuania? What does it feel like walking back in the footsteps of your family?
Well, they've done such an incredibly good job of destroying that heritage. There's not much to see now in the small towns. The cemeteries are, for the most part, abandoned and desecrated. Um, but wherever you go, you do feel the ghost of this great civilization. Um, uh, Vilna or Vilnius is a completely different matter, and so is Kaunas. I was more interested in the small towns and the Steplach of Lithuania, where you won't find much. The names is a very important issue. There were 200 mass killing sites in Lithuania, and just while we're on that subject, Lithuania was the most successful of all Holocaust theaters in the sense that they managed to kill 96.4% of the Jewish population, which I understand was the highest proportion anywhere, anywhere in Europe. But the names, nobody even kept the names. Of these 200 mass killing sites, as I said earlier, only 4 have any names at all. And in Birgé, as I said earlier, where we put a great deal of effort into trying to find out who the names of these people who were murdered, 2,400 people, we were only able to come up with 550 names. The others are lost. They're lost all across Lithuania. And this is a huge tragedy. It cannot be overemphasized. I like to think, however, the culture of Lithuania, of Jewish Lithuania, survived and thrived. And we, you and me, saw it most visibly in South Africa, where we created this remarkable community, which to this day is having ripples across the world. So we can take great pride in the generations that preceded us, and indeed the generations that survived.
Why is it you think Lithuania doesn't come up enough when we talk about Holocaust education? We often hear about the Holocaust in Poland, in Ukraine, in Romania, in Hungary, but for some reason, and as you've just said, Lithuania had the highest percentage when it came to theatre, when it came to the killing of communities. Why is it we are not speaking enough about Lithuania and the experience of Jews during the Shoah in Lithuania?
Really, I think you'll have to ask a Holocaust expert on this. I don't know. But what I suspect is, firstly, the global figures are not that high. There were perhaps between 210 and 220,000 Jews murdered in Lithuania. In Poland, it was 3 million. The figures just don't stack up. It's not demographically as important as other centers of Jewish life in Europe. But I also think it's because of the excellent job done by the Lithuanian government in creating a false narrative, which has essentially blunted any exploration of this. I also think there's a psychological reason. I don't know about you, Rolene, but as I said in my introduction, my family didn't talk much about the Lithuanian Holocaust. We did talk about the Holocaust generally, and it did provide the emotional and psychological and possibly even intellectual backdrop to our family. But Lithuania was never discussed. We had these photographs of relatives who were murdered, and they drifted to the bottom of the pile, and gradually their names weren't written, so gradually we forgot their names, we don't know who they are. And let's face it, nobody likes to talk about the Holocaust, and especially the generations that came immediately after it. I think it's true to say, and I've certainly found this in talking with South African Jews generally, and Lithuanian Jews generally, that nobody discussed the Lithuanian Holocaust. I think the reason for this is that it was just too painful. How can you possibly bring a child up to be healthy and positive and look forward when you have this absolutely terrible psychological baggage behind them? And I do think one of the reasons my film has been so widely seen and commented on by the South African Jewish community is because 3 generations on, I think we are able to look at this and to cast a critical eye on what happened. And I like to think we are the people who will be demanding justice for the victims, that we've come a full circle, and now is the time to make a loud claim for justice on their behalf.
As you just said, it's an imperative that we now, the generations later, become the voices of those that could never speak for themselves. And today is a day, Yom HaShoah, set aside for bearing witness. It shouldn't just be today, it should be all days, as we lose about 40 survivors a day. Soon there will come a time where we won't have those first-hand accounts, those first-hand witness testimony. So it is now up to us. Let's talk a little bit in the remaining minutes about Jacques. It really, really is, it's riveting. It's painful. It's riveting, and it is an absolute must-see documentary. Where is it being screened around the world so that anybody listening can go and see it?
Rolene, we haven't got a very slick PR operation. I made this film, as I said, for no money. We have no marketing budget. We have no marketing expertise, yet it has been shown right across the world. In Israel, it's been shown at Renana Town Hall tonight. It's sold out, I believe. I think it's being shown at Bet Vilna in Tel Aviv tomorrow. This was done at short notice, and I think a lot of tickets are available. It's also being shown at a synagogue in Jerusalem. The best place to look for, I'm afraid I can't remember the name of the synagogue. But the film is free. I've made it free to anybody who wants to show it. So if there are any listeners out there who can arrange a viewing with, and I would encourage people to watch it collectively with other Jewish people, because there is something in the common experience of watching us that electrifies something, that gives us it gives it a coherence and an emotional power. So anybody who wants to organize a viewing of a few families, a synagogue, a community center, or something larger than that, please contact me, perhaps through you, and I will make sure that's possible.
I think let's you and I have a chat off air about bringing it to Modiin. I know that there have been a lot of people here in Modiin who would like to see it. And if anybody is listening and would like to facilitate a viewing, let's have a talk about this. It has been such...
Sorry to interrupt. I would say, though, that the discussion of it is even more important than the film itself. It's how we relate to this lying. It's about our dignity and our self-respect. Let me ask you a question. Let's take Biržai, my own hometown in Lithuania. Let's imagine if 2,400 black people had been segregated, subjected to conditions of slavery, where the girls had been raped, where people had been tortured purely on the basis of their ethnicity, and then everybody had been murdered. Would this be acceptable to anybody? Yet we somehow ignore this, and we allow their ambassadors and their envoys to rub the salt into the wounds by then pretending to care so much, while justifying their government's systemic issuance of lies. And I hope that through these viewings, we can come to some sort of political decision that we will just not accept this. If you ask me what we should do about it, I don't know. This depends on our community leaders across the world. But the first stage must be the recognition of the insult and a determination to do something about it.
Michael Kretzmer, in our final minutes, what is your last message on this Yom HaShoah to our listeners and to people watching?
Well, I would probably, my last message would be, again, in the voice of the victims. It's not really difficult to work out what they would say and what challenges they would set. They would say, how dare people have done this? How dare people lie about it? And what are we going to do about it? If we have any self-respect and any dignity, we must oppose this in any way we can and not allow this charade of forgetting to continue. And I hope my film play some small part in the renaissance of Jewish pride in this regard, and the determination to force Lithuania in any forum we can to be accountable for what it's doing today.
Michael Kretzmer, the producer and director around the award-winning, critically acclaimed documentary J'accuse. Please go see it wherever you can. We're going to try and get it to Modiin. I cannot thank you enough for talking to us on this most sacred day, Yom HaShoah, for giving voice to Lithuanian Jewry, for giving a voice and bearing witness and giving testimony to the thousands whose voices and whose stories were lost for generations. We will not let their deaths, their murders be in vain. I want to say thank you to my engineer behind the scenes, Pe'er Atia, working hard to make sure that all technical gremlins were dissolved. Thank you to you, our listeners, and I will see you again next week on Yom HaZikaron. This has been Modiin and Beyond on Radio Modiin with me, Rolene Marks.
I've heard there was a secret chord that David played and it pleased the Lord. But you don't really care for music, do you? It goes like this: the fourth, the fifth, the minor fall, the major lift, the baffled king composing hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Your faith was strong, but you needed proof. You saw her bathing on the roof, her beauty and the moonlight overthrew you. She tied you to a kitchen chair, and she broke your throne and she cut your hair, and from your lips she drew the hallelujah, 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 hallelujah.